about reading a bottom board, and I read my bottom board religiously. Christine is a master beekeeper. She's also a seasoned and experienced beekeeper. And most of all, she's known as the Petaluma Bee Lady. And I presume you have, I don't know, did you ever keep track of how many swarms you have collected?
This year, probably, with the ones that have been given to me that I just needed to just go pick up in a box, probably 20, which was a
Okay.
much better year, much better than last year, which I only had 5. So
Okay, but you're well known in Sonoma County
Yeah.
as the Petaluma Bee Lady.
yeah, when people have trouble or have difficult swarms, I'm often called to help
Okay,
also.
well, I'm glad you joined us tonight to give us a beautiful presentation.
Yeah, okay. Hello, everyone. I'm just full disclosure. I'm a treatment-free regenerative beekeeper, and I teach from that perspective. But you can learn something from everybody. And reading the monitoring board was taught to me by an extraordinary man named Serge Lebesque, who's now retired from beekeeping, but he started teaching me about reading the debris from the hive. And from there, I took off, and I started adding on to what he's taught me and observing and figuring out what the heck the bees are throwing out and what does it mean. And it actually can give you a lot of clues. So that's, I'm going to talk from that perspective, is that we can, use other things than just going inside the hive. I'm not saying not going in, not go in the hive, but every time before an inspection or in between inspection, I'm always looking at that monitoring board. So I'm going to share screen and see if I can get to my PowerPoint here. I think it's this one. Can you see it? Did it work or?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, except I can't get to. There we go. I want to make it full screen. And then I want to view the slideshow. Okay, can everybody see?
Yep, looks good.
The full screen. Okay. So let me know if there's any problems. Sometimes I just keep talking and suddenly something's not working and I don't know. So I do have my phone here in case there's an issue. All righty. So I call this decoding the monitoring board. And here you have some classes I've taught and some other mentees that are now teaching how to read the monitoring board in our bee association here in Sonoma County. What is a monitoring board? Okay, not everybody uses them. Some people use just solid bottom boards, right? So a monitoring board is a removable tray that slides in and out of the bottom board of a hive where debris from the hive falls. So it would be underneath a screened, a screen, right? And the debris can give clues to what is going on in the hive. And note, I've underlined clues because that's what it actually gives you, right? It's not always 100%, but things can be misinterpreted or, I'll give you then one example of something that sort of duped me once. So it gives you real clues, right? So screen bottom boards can come in from different manufacturers. It's actually harder to find, sometimes find them. I used to love the Country Rube one, which is here, and they don't make it anymore. They have a new version. They sold it to a big outfit that then went bust, and then somebody took it over and they changed the design, and I don't like the new design. But anyway, I'm going to tell you what I like and don't like about some of the bottom boards with screen and monitoring boards. So you have on the left here, the beginner kit. It's inexpensive, but it's open on the front and the back. So bees can go in there, or things have access to it, which can, disrupt the debris Or if some mites have dropped and the bees get on it, the mites can actually jump back onto the bees, right? And there's very little space between the wood and where you slide out the screen. And so sometimes you just scrape off half the debris, which then doesn't give you a good idea about what's going on because everything has fallen off, right? And then there's sometimes some homemade ones that people make. This one has a little slat of wood at the back where you can close it, right? It has no opening in the front, so it's sort of a closed system. And those are better. Again, you know, this may not be enough room between, because sometimes there's a lot of debris, right? Depending on what season it is or what's going on in the hive. So often there isn't really a lot of space between the monitoring tray and the screen or the wood at the end. So we have a man now here in Sonoma County, who's now building a different version, but he's not selling them online. You have to go pick it up on top of Sonoma Mountain. So, he is also, make sure that he has a really like an inch and a half between the screen where the monitoring board comes out, so that when you slide it out, there's no way of scraping the debris off. And then he has a way to close it, so bees or anything else cannot go. I mean, I've had slugs in some of them before I use the closed system, right? There's little critters that can go in there and wreak havoc. Types of monitoring board, right? You have the floppy with grids. Some of them are sticky because some people use these to count mites. But it gets very difficult when you have a lot of debris like on this hive. So if you want to count mites with this system, then you do a 24-hour drop. So you don't have a lot of debris, and then you can sort of gauge where your mites are at. Some people make their own monitoring board in the middle there. This is our 81-year-old beekeeper here in our association, who is the longest standing member and still teaching 4-H. She's always looking for ways of making things on her own. So she goes and picks up all the political signs after they're done, and she cuts them to size. They're a little bit corrugated and they work really beautifully. So, and then you have also, I'm going to minimize. I don't know how to minimize the pictures here. Okay, sorry. You have more of the stiffer plastic, this is sort of my preferred one, because they're easy to clean and they're durable. They don't warp. Some of them are too thin, and over time they really start warping and they get really hard to take in and out. So I like these stiffer plastic ones, which you can make yourself, right? Care of monitoring board. I use a pastry cleaner, a metal one, not my hive tool, because the hive tool scratches everything. And so I use a metal pastry a cleaner. Some people then put some oil, like they spray olive oil or paint some oil on it to sort of make that sticky board if they're using it to count their mites. Or also that way hive beetles that are falling through or are getting ridden by the bees and they fall through the screen, they get stuck on that oily surface as well. Right. So it's easier to clean too when you have a little bit of oil on it. And then it just mimics those commercial sticky board for a lot less money. Right. And then sometimes you have, there is warping that happens. Even the stiffer ones sometimes warp. The thinner ones tend to warp a lot quicker than the thicker ones. And so you have to be mindful of that, because that changes if it's not flat anymore. Debris starts falling on either side or towards the center or in the undulated parts. So make sure that they stay nice and flat if you really want to see what's falling and where the debris is falling. Is it the front, the back, in the middle, everywhere? the left or the right. So that sort of matters. So sometimes I just take my stiffer board and just sort of bend them gently backwards or flip them around the other way when this happens. You know, heat sometimes when we get these really big heat waves can also wreak havoc on your monitoring boards. So one thing you can tell from the monitoring board is the size of your colony, right? So keep in mind, though, the time of year, right? Is a colony small because it's a brand new colony? It's a small swarm you got, or is it small because it's in the fall and it's shrinking in size, right? So keep in mind what time of year you're reading your monitoring board. And then the history of the hive, you know, is it like I said, a small swarm? Is it a split? Is it a growing colony? Is it one that's about to burst and swarm, right? And then the health of the hive, right? Is a colony declining or growing because there's a health issue? And then also, when did you clean it last, right? If you just clean your monitoring board, you may not have a lot of debris. And then your previous notes. Notes are really important. I use my notes all the time. I've gotten to the point now that I use the paint tape, the blue paint tape, and a Sharpie, and I just stick some on the inner cover, and that's where I put all my notes. So every time I go there, I just take off the lid and my notes are right there. I don't lose them. They don't fly off with the wind. And it's really, they're very cryptic. I've come up with my own system of what I need to know and what I need to write down, but to me that works beautifully. And that also can tell you, you know, what you saw last time in the hive and what maybe you should be expecting, right? So the picture on the left here is sort of a smaller colony, right? It's maybe 3 frames of brood, right? The next picture, it is mostly centered in the middle, right? It's a smaller colony, but it's a wider colony, right? So, and then you have larger colonies, like the third picture, where almost every frame is full of brood. And then you have very large colonies that produce, because they're 5 supers high, and they produce tons and tons of debris also, right? And there's so much brood and debris falling from everywhere that you get this full monitoring board with lots and lots of debris. Smell. Okay, I'm just going to bring up smell because we often don't use our other senses in beekeeping. I use my sense of smell all the time. I'm very privileged to mentor a blind beekeeper who has been teaching me all sorts of new skills. Smell is one of them. Touch is one of them. Sound is one of them. And it's amazing how much information you can get from also using your other senses. So when you pull your monitoring board out, just, you know, take a whiff. Is it normal smell, or is there something, an off smell, right? You know, keep in mind that we do have certain nectar sources that can be a little stinky. So don't panic, you know, right away if you have an off smell, right? There could be processing some nectar that is from a more stinky source. Things that may give you a clue of something being not right is AFB or EFB. Right. If you've ever had AFB, that is indistinguishable. It is super strong smell, and it is very, very foul. I equate it to, you know, teenage crusty, stinky socks, right? Or EFB to me smells like more cheesy, right? So I always, you know, keep that in the back of my mind when I open the hive. If you have decaying bees in the hive, there also you can have sort of a decay smell, and that could give you an idea, oh, there might be something going on. Mice urine. If mice have gotten into your hive and they've done their business through the screen, then you might smell, you know, some urine smell. So, but what I want to just say is that off smell just warrants investigation. Put up your little investigative, head on and continue to figure out what would cause the off smell when you open hive. Mostly there isn't an off smell, but I just wanted to bring it up because it does happen on occasion. Moisture, you can find some moisture on your monitoring board, right? And it could be a problem or it could be normal, right? So the picture on the left, for example, is just at the entrance, right? It's just that water or dew is hitting the landing board and it's trickling in, right? So in that situation, I would just tilt my hive slightly forward. I would still keep my hive level. I'm a foundationless beekeeper, so I let my bees draw out all their comb. So I need my hive from side to side to be level. But front to back, you can gently just, make it so that if there is dew, it can just or water collecting there, it can just drip out naturally, right? In the middle picture, the second picture, there's little puddles worth of moisture. You can see one right here. You can see there was a bigger puddle here, and there's a lot of mold, right? So I'm always going, okay, I need to really look what's going on in this hive. Is this hive too much in the shade? Is it not getting enough sun? Is there a ventilation issue? Why is there so much moisture? There are times when the bees are processing lots and lots of nectar that a lot of the moisture does fall down. It hits the ceiling and then it goes down, right? Heat, moisture rises, and then it comes down on the sides and goes down, right? So it's not necessarily a problem that there is moisture on the bottom board, but when there's mold like that, I start thinking, okay, what else is going on? Is there something I can change to help my bees not be so moldy inside, right? And then this one has a large, the third picture has a large central, puddle, lots of, at some point there was lots of debris. It's really hard to read when it's all wet, right? Because everything gets gushy. So that also warrants a little bit of investigation. And also if it's a really large hive processing lots and lots of nectar, you may have a lot more moisture at the bottom. But I would clean that off and I would put it in and I would go check it again in a few days to see if the moisture problem continues or if it was a one-time event or if there might be another problem going on. The other thing I might look at is do a cursory inspection. If it's older equipment and things have warped a little bit, are there cracks? Is there other ways that the moisture or rain or dew is getting inside the hive? And then the very last one, that had an enormous puddle. And this one has a story. This happened in my apiary where the watering system failed or sprung a leak. And the leak went straight into the entrance of the bees and basically doused the entrance, and it fell through the screen and onto the monitoring board. And it took me a while to figure this out. It's like, there's no way bees can produce this much water. And then I went out there at night one time. That's when my water system goes. And I walked in front of the hive and got completely drenched. And I realized, oh my gosh, my watering system sprung a leak. So things like that can happen too, that are nothing to do with the hive, but have to do with the environment. So I fixed that and I didn't have a problem anymore. Debris that is scattered versus nicely organized, right? So the debris can give a really good sense of order. The debris falls between the frames. It falls down in nice little lines, but it's not always like that. Sometimes you have this scattered, weird looking debris and you have to start sort of asking questions. Is this a new colony that's just cleaning out combs? So it's not necessarily in straight lines. Are your frames misaligned? Is your first super and your second super frame not aligned on top of each other, right? I always try to really align my supers so that there's almost an uninterrupted bee space between my frames from top to bottom. It doesn't matter how many supers I have. I want them to be able to, when they drop debris, that it goes all the way down through. It doesn't hit the top of the next top bar from the super below. And then they have to brush that off and it gets all over the place. Also, is your hive requeening? Is there a break in the brood cycle? Maybe it's a time when they're not raising a lot of young. And so there's a lot less debris, right? Is the nest, one thing I'm going to look for is the nest disorganized? Is there queenlessness, right? Or is there wind movement? With the open system, if there's opening in front and the back, sometimes the wind blows through and then just the debris starts just swirling around and gets all, the wind makes the disorganization. So I might, try to figure out how to close it so that I can have that debris undisturbed. And then sometimes, and I'll show you a picture of it, the debris is displaced by wax moth larvae. If you have an open system, the wax moth can go and lay eggs there. If you have a closed system, the bees will remove eggs and larvae and drop them through the screen, and then they finish pupating down in the debris. Not the worst place to be, because there you can remove them and squish them or feed them to your chickens, and they're away from the hive. So not necessarily a bad thing. A colony that is off center. Right. And this can happen sometimes early in the spring when a colony has shrunk to a rather small size and they are sort of drifted on to, here to the right, and may run out of food because they lost contact with the honey on top of them. This one I didn't see on time and the colony ended up starving. You can see all the dead bees on there. So now when I see this on a very warm day in the winter, I try to recenter my colony to the middle and I make sure that they have some stores above them that they can reach. So this is just a little side thing that I've noticed, that every once in a while you have that colony that just veers to one side or to the other. And you can help it by just recentering, taking a couple frames from one side, putting it on the other, and then just recenter it. Do the same thing with the super above if you have another super. So one of the debris we see a lot of is called, what I call it, worker dust, because it looks like sawdust. So I figured I'll call it worker dust. And it's actually workers emerging. So workers birth themselves, they chew themselves out by going in a circle and using the little mandibles, and little by little piece by little pieces, they open up the cell to emerge. So when you see these sawdusty looking lines, you know that you have some workers emerging. The color varies from white to like yellow, brown to very dark, depending how fresh the cappings were. In the spring, they tend to be a lot more lighter because they can produce wax, a new wax to cap the brood, or if it's new comb, it's more likely that they'll cap it with new wax. As you go into summer and into fall, they start recycling some of the wax. Around here, by now, the bees stop pretty much producing wax. We're entering dearth. And so they changed their mode to backfilling everything with nectar, thinking winter now, reproduction is sort of over. And so now we're just gonna, go into more honey production. So, and colonies are going, somebody had mentioned earlier that colonies will start to decrease, and that's true, even though that they might be at the height of their population. But you have to think that your foragers that are out there right now were born, 3 to 6 weeks ago. So, and they all come home at night. And so you may have congestion at the entrance of the hive because they're all trying to get in and there's no room because they're at the height of some of the colonies are at the height of their population, right? And so let's see if they cover everything on here. I think so. drone cappings. So drone cappings are completely different than worker worker cappings are worker dust. Drones look like miniature round cornflakes. And that's because the bees, the workers, help the drones get out. They make that initial cut all the way around like a can opener. And then the drone has an easier time to emerge. They may just have to go through the cocoon to get out, right? This way, the workers can control at any time the drone population. At any time, the workers can cull eggs, larvae, or adults, or even pupa if they are in crisis, or depending on the time of year when if they need to get rid of the drones in the fall. But drones are very, very expensive to raise. They need lots of protein. They need to be fed their entire life, and they take a lot of resources. And when we have inclement weather, they may even get rid of the drones in spring sometimes, because they can always, when times get better, they can always raise them again, right? Especially in spring. So they're dispensable, right? But as you see, here's a blow up picture. They're very, very round, right? Those are drone cappings, very round. You'll see look at other debris that is also bigger, but is more jagged edged, which is something else. But these are perfectly circular. In the one thing I really look for coming out of winter is for these drone cappings, because that to me indicates that swarm season is on its way. Once they produce drones and drones are emerging, usually within 3 weeks or so, we start getting our first swarms, right? At least that's what I've noticed here in Sonoma County. So I thought that's always really exciting. Again, with the weather we've had this year, that was not necessarily true. So nothing is ever absolute with bees, because there's so many different things that will affect their behavior, weather being one of them. So this year was a little bit of a discombobulated. We had a little bit of an swarming happening in March on a couple of nice days we had, and then had some in April, but then we had a whole bunch in June, because the blackberry flow was so good. And if you weren't there ready to give your colonies extra room or some drawn comb to put the nectar in, a lot of the colonies got nectar bound and then swarmed. So it was a little bit different because of the weather this year, but typically when I start seeing these in the early spring or coming out of winter, I'm starting to get my equipment, my swarming stuff ready, my car ready, that I can just jump in and go swarm chasing, because it's about to happen, right? The other thing you can look for, if you start seeing this, for example, in the fall, and it's all drone cappings, and you're going, wait a minute, this is October, November, and all I'll have is drones. So you may have a queen problem, right? Maybe, or a drone layer or laying workers, where there isn't a viable colony anymore. So harder to notice in the spring, because it's also part of when they raise their drones. But when you see this in the fall, for example, it could be a clue that you have a problem in the hive. Pollen is their protein sources, right? And it's really neat to see the different colors that come in. Often early spring is a lot of yellows, and then as we get it really into spring, you start getting the bright oranges and the purples and all sorts of different color. It indicates often that larva is being raised, because the nurse bees need to eat pollen in the form of bee bread to make royal jelly. They need that protein, right? Lots of protein. And more than that, they also need to feed the larvae destined to be workers and the drone larvae some bee bread and also a little bit of nectar on day 3, right? Everybody's fed royal jelly for the first 3 days, but afterwards their diet change. If you're destined to become a worker, you're gonna get a little bit of pollen. So young nurse bees that are nursing need a lot of pollen, and the larvae that are destined to become drones and workers also. So the bees start bringing in more and more pollen, right? But don't get fooled, because if you do have a laying worker colony or a drone laying queen, they're still raising something, and they still would be bringing in some pollen, right? So it's not, again, absolute. There could be different factors happening. But typically when you see lots of pollen, you see worker dust and you see drone cappings, you can assume that, oh my gosh, there's going to be some larvae. They're raising some brood in there, right? The other thing that's really interesting for around here is that gray pollen. Our nectar flow here is March through June usually. And we get a really big flow through April, through middle May, and then we have a little dip right before the blackberry come. We have a mini dearth, and then the blackberry hit, and then the nectar starts really coming in. Not last year because we had the mega drought, but oh boy, did it happen this year. Everything slowed down. They stopped building comb. There was not much coming in. There was very little pollen coming in. They weren't really raising a lot. And then suddenly, boom, the nectar flow hit. They just went berserk, the bees. And we actually have, to our surprise, honey this year in some of our hives, right? So but it's also the last of the big flow here. When the blackberry set fruit, everything starts sort of nosediving, right? There's a lot less nectar. They stop building comb, and they start going into already winter mode, thinking, what do we need to do to start thinking about surviving winter, right? And also, the status of the hive. If your colony is going through a brood break for any reason, you made them make a brood break. They're requeening. There's not, there is no babies being raised. You may have a whole lot less pollen, right? I also said I'm using 2 different words as pollen and bee bread. So for new beekeepers, bee bread is made from pollen with enzymes added from their honey stomachs, which helps break down the pollen. The pollen husk is so tough the bees cannot digest it straight. They need to break it down through fermentation. It's a lacto-fermentation process. And so the bee bread you see in your hive is a live product. It needs to be tended, right? That's why you can't take it out, let it dry out, and give it back to them. They'll just clean it out, or freeze it and give it back to them, right? It's a live product that the bees need to tend. Wax flakes is their building material, right? So you see, when you put a swarm in a box, oh my gosh, that's when you see the most wax flakes, because they come with full bellies and they're primed for building comb. They know they have to do it fast so that queen can start laying, that can regenerate the colony, and then also get ready for winter. They have a huge job. So they are just primed for building, right? They look like little glass shards. Wax production is directly correlated with the main nectar flow in your area. And it can stop and start sometimes also, depending how much nectar it is. Of course, if you're feeding sugar water, then you're stimulating a nectar flow, right? And so that can stimulate wax production. So I'm talking more on, in the natural sense, that when you see those wax flakes, the nectar flow is going. What it also means is that you have a good population and you have young bees present in the hive. I think it's around 5 to 10 days old that it's prime time for bees to build comb. As you may or may not know, bees change their jobs as they age, And one of the jobs they do at a certain age is build comb. And they have these wax glands on their bellies. They have 3, 6, I think 9 pairs. I forget now the number. I have to go look at my notes again. But they exude this liquid on this very shiny little places on the abdomen called mirrors. And as the liquid gets on there, it cools and makes these little wax flakes, which they can manipulate then and then build the comb. Propolis, right? It's mostly seen in the hive, but on occasion it's seen on the monitoring board. So propolis is a resin that the bees take from the environment, usually from young shoots of plants. Plants protect themselves from bacteria and viruses and fungus by making resin to protect the buds, right? And otherwise everything would be eating them because they're so tender. And the bees have figured out how to scrape that off and use those same benefits of antibacterial, antifungal, antiviral properties of those resins, and they can scrape it off, put it in their pollen basket, and bring it in the hive. Usually they put a little bit of wax in there to make it more pliable. The bees cannot dislodge it themselves. They need another bees to pull it off their legs. That's how sticky that stuff is. They seal all the nooks and crannies. They coat things. They coat the cells after they've been used. They any rough surface. So if you want to promote propolis in your hive, start roughening the sides of your hives. They don't recognize smooth surfaces to propolis because they've evolved in trees where it's pretty rough. And that stimulates them to bring in propolis and put it on. The picture on the left here, this is the monitoring board I pulled out, and look at this brown, long, sticky thing there. All the way along is propolis. And why in the world did that melt down onto the monitoring board? Well, this happened during a heat wave. I had added additional shade to my hives. I put a piece of plywood on top. I used to do umbrellas, but there's been too much wind. So I just used, a third of a sheet of a plywood and just extend the roof. But didn't realize, oh my goodness, I live on a hill, and between 2 and 4, the hottest part of the day, the sun hits the back of my hives. And so that heat melted some of the propolis in the hive, and it just dripped all the way down. Gosh, I felt so bad because my bees got overheated. So now when I know it's 90 and above, I also lean a piece of plywood on the back of the hive to provide that extra shade, right? So that gave me a clue there was a heat problem in my hive. Same thing here in the middle. Somebody brought this to a bee meeting and like, what is this? And it's very weird, just like these stalagmites. And we started poking and smelling and manipulating, and we go, oh my goodness, this is propolis, right? Again, right? It was so hot. They weren't even raising bees anymore. There was a long heat wave, and all you had is this melted propolis. The hive was way too hot, right? Provide more shade to a hive like that. Make sure there's plenty of water around. With our weather being so extreme, we're gonna get more of these just crazy heat waves, I suspect. And then, the upper picture here, that's a bee with propolis. When you see it on bees, as opposed to it being pollen, is that it's very shiny looking. So pay attention when you're in the hive, especially in the upper part of the hive. You see bees running around with their pollen baskets full. Often they have propolis on it, and they're running around trying to find a place to or finding help from another bee to take it off them and then to put it where it needs to be put. So, and it tends to ramp up in the summer and early fall. So if you have new equipment and don't have a lot of propolis, often by the end of summer and early fall, you're going to start noticing that it's going to be harder to open your lid and to move your frames. The picture on the last picture on the bottom right is this really weird looking curved thing. And this is beekeeper made debris. This is me cleaning, scraping in between two frames, some propolis, because the frames hadn't been put completely next to each other, and there was a little bit of space, too small for the bees to patrol, so they stuck a bunch of propolis in there. But then my frames weren't nicely put together, and I was violating a little bit of bee space, and they were bulging out the combs. So I had to clean a little bit of that, and some of it fell on the ground, on the monitoring board. So that was a beekeeper made debris of propolis. Eating through stores, chewed up cappings. So a little different than the sawdust part. It has a slightly different texture when they're going through some of their honey stores. And you may see this coming out of winter more, but sometimes you see it too in dearth times when there's not enough nectar coming in and they're hungry and they start hitting their stores in dearth. It has a little bit of a different texture. It's a little bit more curly looking as opposed to sawdusty looking. And you know that, but when you see that, it's a little bit different than like I said, the sawdust, that they're hitting the stores. And if you know you've had honey on the sides, and there's the brood, so you can see this on the picture on the left, the sawdusty part and worker dust is in the middle. And then this is where the honey was stored on either side. The debris is slightly different, right? And so they're going through stores. And here too, right? They're just eating through their stores. So I know, this correlates to, okay, what's going on in this hive? What's going on with the weather? What's going on with the nectar flow, right? What does that mean to my bees? Are they shutting down? Are they noticing the cues of the season? If I have bees that don't know how to shut down when there's a dearth and keep making brood, and they go through all their stores, we call those colonies all brood, no food. They're not acclimated. They're not going to have enough honey for winter. I really don't want those bees, because if I can help it, I don't want to feed my bees sugar water. I want to have those bees that know how to do, what to do, when to do it here in my climate. Every once in a while, we'll give them a crutch, but only once. I want to find those resilient bees that know how to live in my area, and know when to work hard and know when to shut down. So that gives me a clue about what's going on in the hive, and I always go check, what is that colony doing? Also, when they're eating through stores, sometimes they hit crystallized honey. And so you would see almost this like snow-like debris. And if you take your finger and you lick it and you go on there and you take some on your finger, it sticks because you just wet your finger and you eat it, it tastes like sugar, right? So crystallized honey cannot be fully eaten by bees. They can siphon off the liquid that's left in there, and then the crystals they just throw out. So I also know they're going through stores when I see these crystals. Way up on top left is just magnified one of these little sugar crystals. Sometimes you see these absolute mountains of debris. The picture, I was trying to take a good picture of it, but the one on the left, you can see it's almost an inch high. And I was like, oh my gosh, what are they doing? Well, this is a colony that, this is early spring. During the winter, they had moved up through the supers, right? And they had reached the top, and they were growing and expanding, and they were moving back down again. They had abandoned the bottom part of the hive while they were clustered and going through the honey stores that was stored above them. And then they were suddenly going back down and they were hitting old comb and old bee bread, dried up bee bread. And they just went into cleaning mode because they needed nice clean cells for the queen to inspect and lay eggs in again. And suddenly you have this enormous pile of debris. This can also happen when you have a move-in, when you have a dead out that you haven't cleaned out and a swarm moved in. And the first thing they do, they go into hyper cleaning mode and they clean everything out. And you have all this debris from their house cleaning. Cleaning out old cocoons, right? So that's another thing. When I'm not sure if everybody knows, maybe some new beekeepers don't know, but bees spin cocoons, or at least pre-pupa spin cocoons. So when a larva is nice and fat and is ready to be capped, it stands up, the bees cap it, and they have two little spinnerets, and they spin a silk cocoon. It's called a partial cocoon because they also have already the walls of the cell to help them, but the cocoon makes them nice and tight and will help them to go through metamorphosis and grow and then inside that cocoon, they will grow their eyes, their wings, their legs, their antennas. And when they emerge, bees will clean out some of the leftover cocoon. And so you can see these round papery looking things, right, are the bottom of the cell where the cocoon was. And they've pulled that out to clean it for the next generation to come, right? So you can see little pieces of cocoon. The blue arrows are pointing to the other parts of the cocoon that were on the side of the cells, right? They look like brown little papery debris. So, when you touch them, they feel like little silk. Exuviae. So larvae cannot grow past their skin. They need to shed, sort of like a snake, right? A lot of insects with exoskeletons have to shed when they grow. Well, larvae also need to shed to be able to grow. They do it 5 times and then a 6th time right before they emerge from pupating. As the larva grows, the debris gets larger and larger and the bees just sort of throw it out. And so you'll see these little white, very light, if it's a little bit of a breeze, they'll fly off. That's how light these little skins are. That you can sort of see the curve of the larva, the shape of the larva at some point. This was the skin of the larva, right? In the biology books, they call them instars. So you have the first instar, the second instar, the third instar, the fourth instar, and the fifth instar. So that's what when they talk, for a long time I was reading instar this, instar that, and I didn't know what that meant. So now I know, and so do you. The 6th instar, exuviae, looks very, very different because mostly you only see the exuviae of the antenna. So for a very long time, I would see these little twirly little debris. And I'm like, gosh, that must be some little critter that pupating in the debris that's taking advantage. And, but I couldn't see any insects. And, they look like little corkscrew. Well, it's the antenna. It's the exuviae of the antenna. That was sort of a big light bulb that came out. And it's actually my mentor who sort of bypassing said, oh, by the way, those are the 6th instar exuviae. So that means to me that I have some bees emerging, right? If I see that kind of debris, then I know that I have some bees that are emerging. pests. Oh my goodness, mites. I don't know if any of you ever had mites. Mice get into your colonies. If you look at the bottom picture, it does not take a lot. This mouse chewed this isn't one of those normal little square entrance reduction that you turn around and have different size entrances. Well, look at that. It doesn't take a lot for a little mouse to be able to go in there, and they can wreak havoc, right? They can eat comb, they can nest in there, they can bring in nest material, they poop all over the place, they gnaw on the wood for their teeth. And you really don't want that. It starts really smelling like it really starts smelling bad. So especially if you live in the country, you're more likely to have mice, especially in the fall when everybody's ready to find a nice warm place to overwinter. I have mice guards on all my my entrances. You only have to have mice in your hive once before you realize, okay, it's just worth having those little mice guards on, especially starting. I would start, early September, sometimes to put them on. Poops, right? Different kinds of poops. So insect poops is called frass. So I'll call them frass from now on. If you see rectangular black little frass like these over here, those are wax moth frass. Now, don't panic to think, oh my gosh, my hive is full of wax moth. Not necessarily. The bees are removing this. If you have a very good hygienic colony and a strong colony, they're throwing those little eggs and larvae out all the time. Wax moths are very clever. They can mask their pheromones and they go inside the hive at nighttime. They run around like mad. They lay eggs in many crevices as they can, and they get out. And every day these are patrolling, and now they recognize it. When they first came to this country, it was the bane of every beekeeper's existence to have wax moth. Today, it's only if you have wax moth inside the hive, it's a sign of weakness. Either your hive is too big for its britches, there's too much comb the bees can't patrol, or it's a dead out, or it's stored equipment that is not stored properly. It's stored in a warm, dark place, right? But most of the bees today know how to deal with the wax moth over evolution and time. They know how to recognize them. So often, they'll throw them out on the monitoring board, and then they continue pupating there. And why not there rather than inside the hive, right? So you can clean them up. Sometimes they will wax moth larva will crawl under the screen where you can't see it and pupate there, and then emerge. But then next time you open it, it flies out, or you have an adult wax moth on the monitoring board. It can't go in the hive because of the screen, falls on the monitoring board, and you squish it, and you've gotten rid of the problem. When you have frass that looks like miniature poppy seeds, those are earwicks. And earwicks are opportunists. They like warm, moist places. There are often if you have a vent on the back, or between the inner and outer cover. Or sometimes they hang out right at the edges of the monitoring board. When you open it, there's a whole bunch of them laying right there. They don't do really anything to the hive. They just like some debris, and they like to eat some debris, and they like the moist, warm air from hives. However, if this is a continuous problem, it may be that your hive is in a little bit too damp a place, right? So I put that in my things to look at when I go into a hive that has a lot of earwig frass. Is that colony in a little bit of a cold sink, or into an area where it's just wet and damp? Maybe that colony could benefit being a little bit more in the sun. Okay, so that's something I would look at. And then again, we've already talked about mice and rat feces if they get in. Most people recognize those because we've all had them somewhere in our house or garage at some point. And then if you see these really flat looking spots, they can be yellow, brownish, that's dysentery. And I'll talk a little bit more about dysentery in just a bit. The bees have basically diarrhea, and it can be due to different, to several different things. Again, there's a wax moth. I just wanted to show how sometimes they pupate and sort of move some of the debris around because they use some of the debris to tunnel and cocoon. And then when you pull it off, picture on the top right, you see that there's some larvae that are about to go through pupation and become wax moths. So I just throw these to my chickens, which just love me when I come with a handful of these, right? So again, I'm not too upset if the wax moths are on my monitoring board. My system is closed. The wax moths can't go in there and lay eggs. I know it's my bees getting rid of the wax moths in the hive, and they're throwing them out. Pest varroa mites. So that's one of those things that is very controversial. So I'm not going to go too much into the controversy of treatment versus no treatment. But I definitely look at the mite count on my monitoring board. If I have a large mite drop, I immediately will go into the bird nest, and I'm looking to see if the bees are managing it or they're not managing it. I'm looking for hygienic behavior. I'm looking if they're cleaning their cells out and reusing those cells immediately. I'm looking for health. I'm looking at the color of the larva. I'm looking to see if there's bees with their tongue sticking out half dead. I'm looking to see if I have a melty larva. I'm looking for parasitic mite syndrome. And then I interfere only then. If I feel like the bees manage it, I leave them manage it, right? So, because I'm looking for the hygienic behavior, I'm looking for good genetics. The other thing about mite drops, time of year matters, right? So when is it that you're seeing a lot of mites? If I have a colony that comes out of winter with a lot of mites, I know that colony is in trouble, and I will requeen that colony as soon as reproduction time is here. I will pinch that queen. I will most often in the spring, I will let them make a new queen because that gives them that break in the brood cycle to go into cleaning mode. The mites will be phoretic, hopefully getting cleaned off. And yes, it will set the colony back, but it's one way for me not to use, to use chemicals. It also depends on what stage the colony is, younger colony versus older colony. The size of the colony will matter about mite drop. And some people use the monitoring system to give them clues about what's going on mite-wise, right? They can count mites or know that there is, there might potentially be a mite problem. So, and I'll leave it at that. Pollen mites. Did anybody know that we have pollen mites? No, pollen mites are very different. They're not there to wreak havoc in the hive. They're not there to transmit disease as far as we know. They're like to eat bee bread that's old and abandoned. And so you will see this more in the early spring when the colonies are all the way up and are eating their stores and have abandoned the bottom of the hive where all the bee bread was stored. And they start just eating the pollen, and it makes this sort of like flour consistency. It looks like flour. It's very, 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 very fine. It looks like brown flour. Right. And there's a picture of one. They're very tiny. They're minuscules. You can't see them with your naked eye, but this is what they would look like if they were magnified. So I just clean this off, and I know that, oh my gosh, if my bottom super is completely empty at that point, And, you know, it's older comb. I might think to take that super off and putting a clean super with fresh frames and cycle out some of the old comb. But don't waste your time, because the bees will come back down. And if you want to do this and sort of cycle out some comb, they may move back down into that comb very quickly when they're expanding. So I've done it too late where I'm like, oh my gosh, it's full of brood. Now I can't do it. I had to wait another season to cycle it out because I didn't want to take it out with eggs and larvae in it. So that's the way I sort of gauge when I see this. It gives me an opportunity to see what's going on in that bottom super and whether I want to start cycling that out. Ants, pests or foe, and they can be sort of both, right? Oops. I take a lot of time just watching what those ants are doing, and it's sort of really funny sometimes. This ant is just dragging a piece of a bee abdomen. This ant is carrying a varroa mite. This one is dragging a bee leg. This one over here, they're working in tandem to moving it's an adult wax moth. So they're really, you know, they're doing a job in some ways. They're the carrion of the insect world, sort of like vultures are. They like to eat dead stuff and carry things off and bring them to their nests. So in that sense, they're cleaning, right? But they can also be a pest, right? So when they are going inside the hive and the bees aren't keeping them at bay. So the picture on the right there, where you see this big highway of ants, then you might, you know, want to investigate. Well, am I feeding something in my feeder box and the ants are attracted to it? Is that what's going on? Or is my colony crashing and they're going in there because there's dead brood or there's dead bees that are not being taken care of, and they're like, woohoo, there's lots of food in there. Not only there's abandoned nectar and honey, there's also, you know, dead stuff for us to eat, right? So when I see these, they're going inside the hive, it's definitely warrants investigation. One thing I've noticed that when we have a lot of rain, that sometimes the ants will move their colony in between the inner and outer cover. And you have a whole ant nest there with their little eggs and thousands and thousands of ants hanging out nicely, under the inner cover, away from the rain. And so I just either brush them off or take my torch and torch them off. So that happens too because of weather. They want to go up into something nice and dry and warm. And if they can sneak in and get a little bit of sweets there, that's not a bad thing for them too. So that's my big thing on ants. Really good, strong colonies usually can keep the ants at bay, right? But smaller colonies or colonies that cannot patrol their entire hives, their hive is too big for them, then they may really get in trouble with the ants. The ants sort of sense something is wrong sometimes. So I might go in there if I see that the colony has become small. I might reduce that colony into a smaller hive. I've put sometimes some in a nuke box if they got really small, or I use follower boards inside, those dummy boards, and I can shrink the hive inside and make it smaller within the regular boxes if I need to. And the bees have a much easier time to patrol and keep the ants away from the brood and their food. Oh, those large, tiny little hive beetles. We see them on occasion. We haven't, and I suspect because you're further north, either similar or you have even less of a problem with them. They mostly, are carried here with the commercial beekeepers. We're so close to the whole almond industry. It's just 30 miles away from me. We have commercial beekeepers parking their hives all over the place. So we get the influx of the traveling hives bringing stuff in all the time. So we may have a little bit more of the beetles down here. It's not really yet the right climate here. They're really like places like Texas, Florida, Hawaii, humid, sandy places, because the larvae, when they're nice and fat and ready to pupate, go into the soil to do that. So they need some moisture, and sometimes we're too dry or too cold here for them to go through that process of turning into beetles. But you may see them on occasion on the monitoring board, because the bees will also remove the eggs from, and larvae, the same way they do the wax moth, and throw them onto the debris. The larvae look slightly different than wax moths. They have a slight pinkish hue, and they look ribbed, sort of like bumpy. And they don't make silk. So they won't like sort of silk and pupate. They need to go into the ground to do that. So you won't see like tunnels of silk with them. And they tend to be in multiples. There's lots of them. Wax moth, unless you have a really bad infestation, they don't come in like this amount usually. And you will see them under the debris. And if they're alive, they may even lay eggs in the debris and continue the cycle. Sometimes you see them dead on the monitoring board. So you're like going, oh, good job, bees. Maybe you're taking care of those darn little beetles, right? So they have strategies sometimes how to deal with hive beetles. Inside the hive, you will see them also without silk. They will it will look sort of shiny like that. They unfortunately have their excrement sort of ferments the honey and ruins the honey, and it starts to ooze and bubble, and then it's no good for the bees, and it's no good for human consumption. So just, look for that. Mostly we see a problem when bees cannot patrol their comb. So we've had like a bee tree that fell and all the comb collapsed on itself, and the bees couldn't patrol in between. And by the time we did the extraction, it took some time to organize everything. And by the time we took everything apart, it was full of these little larvae, because the bees just couldn't get to it and clean them. And they took that opportunity to start munching on everything, right? So, or what I've had one year, I've had some drawn comb that had, unbeknownst to me, some eggs, some beetle eggs in it. And I left them for 2 months in my kitchen thinking, oh, I'll get to it. And then they just completely destroyed. I think I had 10 frames of beautiful honey. And so now I tend to I freeze them 48 hours if I can't get to my honey to harvest it, or I harvest it right away and just not wait. If it comes out of the hive, it goes directly into the extractor. The sap beetle, interestingly, I haven't seen it a lot anymore, but for a while we saw this other beetle that was very much like the hive beetle. It also had those little clubbed antennas, but it was much longer, and you could actually see the segments. Here's a comparison of the hive beetle is wider, fatter. You don't see all the segments because the wings cover the segments, but the sap beetle, you see more of the segments. But the telltale is those little antennas with little flat areas. The hive beetles came from sub-Saharan Africa. Probably doesn't need the hives or honey to survive. It can survive on fruit, right? It probably came on a ship on some fruit somehow with the imports, right? The sap beetle, on the other hand, came, I think, from Australia. and was imported on bees that were, I think, in packaged bees that came from Australia. For a short time, they opened the borders again because they didn't, I think that's around CCD, they didn't have enough bees to pollinate. And so they got permission to buy some bees from Australia. Well, they did all sorts of health assessments to make sure they were healthy. But one thing they didn't look at is this little beetle, and works very similar to the hive beetles. They lay eggs, the larvae then just basically destroy the comb. This is my actually my box full of frames that got destroyed by hive beetles. You can see the mess it can make. So now just to prevent this, I extract my honey right away. So anyway, so you may see these longer, skinnier ones and these fatter, wider ones. They're just from two different places of the world, but they sort of do the same kind of they can do the same kind of damage. Fortunately, we really don't see it as a major pest here yet. It's still a minor pest. And I have a sense that we can talk about it when we have question and answer, but my sense is that for you, it's the same. Here's just a comparison of wax moth and beetle moths of larvae, right? So the beetle larvae are much more sort of spiky. They have these little spines. The head is very beetle-like, right? The wax moth is a little fatter, a bigger head. Sort of looks different. Once you see them side by side, it's very apparent that they're different, right? So there's the adults. We have a greater wax moth and a lesser wax moth. So one is just bigger and one is smaller. Before we knew what the sap beetles were, we called this the greater hive beetles and the lesser hive beetle. And then finally somebody in the scientific community identified the smaller hive beetles. Types of hygienic behavior, right? So we have different ways bees remove the sick and the dead or the parasitized. One of them is decapping and removing the sick and parasitized pupa. And what usually happens is that a bee patrols, senses that there's either maybe a mite or there's a disease in there, and she will pierce and make a hole in the capping. And then another bee will come and open it up and remove it and do a removal of the pupa. And so what you would see on the monitoring board is these more jagged edge, big debris. Now, I also put a drone capping here. And remember how round I said they were? Well, these aren't quite as round. You can see, sometimes you can even see the hole, the initial hole, the pierced capping before they removed it. And then they open it up like a can opener, but they don't, they don't have to make a nice cut. They just, as fast as they can, open it and throw it out. And what you would see also is these little bits of pupa. See right next to this capping? This is a piece of a pupa, right? So you can see that they're removing. Right here is a scale. This is a dried up either pupa or larva, right? So this hive to me is in trouble, because they're removing an awful lot of either pupa or larva. So I really start looking at the health of the hive, and then I decide what I'm going to do with this hive. So I call them hygienic flakes, just so that we can identify and have a name for them. So we have drone cappings, and then we have the hygienic flakes. There's also a relatively new behavior that we're seeing, and that is decapping and recapping. And what you would see in the hive is ball brood. So you would look in there and you would see a pupa that's developing, and it's looking straight up at you because its eyes are starting to turn purple. It's at the purple stage of development. But they're not removing the pupa. They're actually slowly making a larger ledge around it, like a little volcano, and then suddenly they recap it. And it looks like a little dome, and it doesn't look as big as a drone brood, but it's slightly raised. That's how you can tell that they've recapped it. And so for those, I haven't quite identified, what the debris exactly looks like, but I suspect it's very similar to a larger debris because they're opening the cells, they're changing the atmosphere so the mite can't reproduce in there, and the humidity, and then they recap it, and that pupa can actually finish pupating and emerge as a full adult. Now, how brilliant is that? Because when you remove a pupa, you're losing population. When you decap and recap, you can have that population and can be very beneficial for the hive. You're not losing a whole bunch of population. They can emerge as adults and be functioning adults. There is a caveat. They may be slightly smaller, maybe not live as long, but they have a full functioning adult coming at the other end. And that to me is really exciting. It's to watch what the bees can come up with to survive in this world today with all the things that's being thrown at them. It's absolutely, to me, extraordinary. Disease and parasites, so what can we see here? Do you see these little scales on the monitoring board, right? These are dried up larvae or pupa, right, that have been removed. They've just melted and dried. Here you can see also pieces. This is a pupa because you can start seeing the segments. So it started pupating. When you start seeing segments, there was some pupation happening. This one has a lot of mites, right? So this colony might have a mite issue, right? Or they're trying to deal with a mite issue. The scales could be anything. It could be European foul brood. It's not American foul brood. That's the one where you have to burn everything. With American foul brood, they cannot remove the scales. The scales stay stuck and glued to the side of the cell. With European foul brood, the scale pop out. So that's how you can sometimes know the difference with the scales. If you take a little stick and you're able to pop out those scales, you go, a big sigh of relief. It's only European foul brood. Not that it's a good thing, but it's better than American foul brood. Right. Or it could be chill brood too. So in the spring, when colonies grow really fast and you have a cold snap and they grew too fast, and when it gets cold, they cluster tight. If it gets very cold, they cluster even tighter. And sometimes they have to abandon the outskirts of the nest, and those little larvae just chill and die, and then they remove them during the day. So, but that you would see that when you're in the hive because it only happens on the outskirts of the nest. You can see that it's sort of like on the edges, not in the center, right? So with chill brood. So, when you see pieces of pupa and debris like this, there's they're dealing with something. And I go right in there and I determine, is this colony able to deal with it or not? Do I need to interfere or not, right? And then, of course, their viruses can ramp up and all that. Chalk brood. Chalk brood is a fungal disease. I've had it. Not for a long time, thank goodness. I don't like to have it. It doesn't kill a colony. It certainly sort of slows down the development because they lose an awful lot of bees to the fungus. And it's not a colony that you can split, because if you split it, you spread it. You can't use the resources from this colony into another hive because you spread it. And it's sort of difficult to get rid of once you have it because it's spore ridden. Anything that makes spores makes it about a bazillion. And it's in the hive in large amounts. And as soon as there is a weakness, it can, even if they beat it, it rears its ugly head again. So I sometimes will, if it's really bad, I will euthanize a colony that has chalk brood, because I really don't want it in my apiary. I don't want it to spread. I don't want it, if that colony gets robbed out or anything like that, because it's crashing in population, and then bees start bringing it all, home into other hives. I really don't want it. So what you would see is these little, they call it chalk brood because they look like little pieces of chalk. But they change color. They go from white to, and they end up brown and then completely black. That's just the fruiting body doing its thing, right? It just finished fruiting by the time it becomes black, and then the spores are there by the bazillions. You will see them, they will remove them. You'll see them on your landing board. You'll see them, you can see here on the monitoring board. Sometimes there's piles of them in front of the hive, and they just clean them out, and then reuse those cells. And then of course, half of the new bees that are re-raised in those cells get it, and it's just sort of self-perpetuates. It is in the literature, it says, oh, it's a ventilation problem. It's more than a ventilation problem. Just adding a little bit of ventilation does not solve the problem. I think it's a genetic weakness. And so again, that's something I don't want in my apiary. Here is something that looks like chalk brood, but isn't. So I get pictures, or people invite me over their hive and they think they have chalk brood because it sort of looks chalky, right? But look, it's not the right shape. I'm going to go back, right? It's more rectangular. You can see where the head of the pupa would be before it got consumed from the fungus. It's just not that circular hexagonal shape, right? So this is actually old bee bread that the bees have removed. It's dried, and you can sort of see that this is the bottom of the cell. See that shape, that Y shape? This is just the imprint of the bottom of the cell, right? So this is just old discarded pollen. So good, the bees are doing cleanup work because they need those cells. They're moving back into areas that have been abandoned. Okay, let's go back to the dysentery. Is it disease? Is it stress or diet? And it could be either, right? So dysentery, which is diarrhea, it can be caused by honeydew and other non-nectar sources. I had a beekeeper make this very strange concoction in his sugar water because he was going to help the bees with all sorts of herbs and God knows what else he was putting in there. And it was so strong, and I tasted it and I had to spit it out. And the bees got diarrhea out of it because they couldn't digest his concoction. So be really careful what you're doing when you're adding things to your sugar water, right? Honeydew is, it happens more often in drought years when there is no nectar and the bees are desperate and they're attracted to anything sweet. And aphids and scales eat sap and then excrete a very sweet substance. It's just sort of digested sap. Ants take advantage of it, but bees can also. And it's usually very dark, almost black. It's very hard to extract. It tastes like molasses. And the bees, unfortunately, can't digest it. When beekeepers recognize it in their hive, they take it out and replace it with either, more regular honey or, feed them sugar water back if they don't have any food, if that's all they have, because they can end up having dysentery when they hit those stores. The other thing that can create dysentery is Nosema apis. Nosema is a microsporidian that attacks the walls of the digestive system, their stomachs. And then they can't digest properly, and they get dysentery. The bees try to clean it up, and by trying to clean it up, they infect other, they get reinfected. There is another kind of Nosema called Nosema ceranae, which does not have any symptoms. You just have a dwindling colony and you don't know why. So Nosema apis is actually being displaced by the Nosema ceranae without symptoms. Sometimes one disease just takes over another because it's stronger, smarter, whatever it is. There's sort of more taking over. So we're seeing less and less of Nosema apis. The other thing that can create dysentery is fermented sugar water. So if your bees are not drinking that sugar water that you're feeding fast enough, it can ferment. The picture I have right below here that looks like this messy goo, they put branches in there so the bees wouldn't drown, and put sugar water in there, and it fermented, and actually some bees even drowned in there anyway. It was a complete mess. And the front of the hive is the next picture over, right? It looked like it's just splattered with dysentery. Inside the hive, splattered with dysentery. Well, according to the books, you would just say, well, this is Nosema apis. It just looks like it. Well, in this situation, it wasn't. So try not to jump to conclusion, become an investigator. Make sure that that's not something else that is creating the dysentery. The other thing that can create dysentery is difficulties in thermoregulation of very small colonies. Sometimes coming out of winter where they're just barely making it, you have a queen and just this tiny little ball of bees, and then you have a bunch of spots around it. They're just too small. They lost critical mass and they just can't keep warm, and they get sick, and they can have some dysentery. Usually that you only see inside the hive. They're not strong enough to go fly out and make spots on the entrance of the hive. So again, with bees, it's never just one thing, right? You got to think all these different things. Be curious, investigate, don't jump to conclusion, and just know that it just could be a lot of different things. So do your investigation. Dead bees on the monitoring board is never a good idea. Since I have a closed system, it's closed in the front, it's closed in the back, nothing should be able to come in. And in this one particular hive, I kept getting lots and lots of dead bees. And I'm like, how in the world are they getting in, right? I put in a different monitoring board. I looked around, I could not figure it out. And finally, I took the whole bottom board off and switched it with another one, and that fixed the problem. And then I looked, and I had a defect in the screen. I had a hole in the screen. The bees were able to crawl in, and they were not able to crawl back out. It became a trap. I felt really bad, but I'm glad I finally figured it out, because that colony was losing a lot of bees, right? So that can happen. Or if there is a slot there to put a string to pull it in and out, sometimes it's too big and bees can crawl in there. They're attracted down there for some reason, and they can crawl in, right? So just, look to see if there's an equipment issue. Now, if the front of it is open and the back of it is open, the bees can crawl in there, then that, of course, that's can be your issue. But if you have a closed system, then you should not have some dead bees on it. Interestingly is to see that how the mites crawl. I just was watching these mites crawl on these dead bees. I spent a lot of time staring at my monitoring board, as you can tell. This dead bee was just covered with mites. These mites were crawling on top of her. And that just showed me how important a screen bottom board can be for helping the bees manage mites, right? The mites fall through the screen and they cannot crawl back up. right? Now, if the monitoring board is too close to the screen and there's a big pile of debris and they can climb the mountain of debris and crawl back in, they can. But mites are really good at jumping back on bees. So if you have solid bottom board and they're dropping the mites, they can actually jump back on a bee and continue the cycle. So, so watch for that. Robbing, right? Hives under siege. So you would start seeing, not only would you start seeing bees flying all around the hive if the hive was still under siege and not dead already. The bees are trying to get in, the robbers in every nook and crannies. They're trying to find every entrance possible. And then if the robbers are starting to be able to get in and fighting, the colony is trying to fight them off inside the hive, which is sort of the next stage. It's past the robber trying to investigate to get in. They're actually getting in and they're fighting. They're pulling their legs and their wings and they're just fighting in there. And so, just a second. Hey, Nate. Nate, can you be quiet, please? Thank you. Sorry, that was my son coming home. And you can start seeing that there's been battling. You can see wings and all sorts of bee parts. And so you have either a really weak hive that you need to deal with or a hive that's succumbing to robbers. It might have already succumbed at this point. Sometimes it is yellow jackets that can do that. Mostly then you would see the debris more towards the front because yellow jackets get up before bees in the morning. I don't know if you've ever sat in the morning next to your hive with your cup of coffee and you see this nasty little yellow jacket just flying right in because the bees it's still cold. The bees are still festooned and tied together and she is sometimes repelled out or sometimes she just drags out a bee, right? She just plucks one off right at the bottom of the festooning bees or the clustered bees, and she flies off. And sometimes they fight her, right? They fight the yellow jackets, and it's sort of the same. They pull each other's legs and heads and legs off, right? So in that instance, you can think about putting rubber screens on, or it's really a good time now to put those yellow jacket traps out. Some people put them out very early in the season because they try to capture the queens. I've never had luck capturing queens. I'm just starting to see yellow jackets sort of patrolling in my yard right now. So they are starting to ramp up in population and can, become a problem here this summer. Another sign of robbing, if the bees have actually got to the honey stores, is really big chunks of debris. By here, your colony is pretty much gone, and the robbers are just helping themselves, and they know they're not supposed to be there, so they're very frantic. When you open a hive that's being robbed, first of all, they all fly up at the top. They're very loud, and they know they're not supposed to be there. Usually they don't sting because it's not their hive to defend. But still wear your veil anyway. But the monitoring board will be full of really big chunks. They just rip everything open, right? The entrance will also get sticky because they're tracking some of the honey out. It's very frantic and very, it's pillaging basically. And sometimes you get also bigger chunks of debris, which is not caused by robbing. This is here I introduced a drawn comb and the bees cleaned it out. They cut the edges off, the broken pieces, and they threw that out. But I knew this because I wrote on my thing, introduce comb. So when I opened it, I knew it wasn't robbing, right? I knew that I had introduced a comb and it looked like cleaning. So just FYI, it's not always one thing. Newspaper, this white fluffy stuff, if you've ever combined the colony and they chewed through the newspaper. For those who don't know this, sometimes two colonies can be combined if one is queenless and one is queen right, or for whatever reason, 2-week hives have a better chance to survive in winter than 2-week ones, or whatever the reason is of combining colonies. You can put a sheet of newspaper with a couple slits in it and combine the colony. The pheromone of the queen-white colony eventually rises through the paper, and there's a slow introduction of bees, and usually things are copacetic, usually. And then they start removing the newspaper by just chewing it off a little bit, and it just makes this fluff at the bottom, on the bottom board. Rubber band and paint, bright colored specks. So this kind of really threw me off. I was like, oh my gosh, there's electric green debris on my, what the heck are the bees bringing in, And, I had forgotten to write this down, that I had done some comb correction. Since I'm foundationless, every once in a while I get some comb that curves the wrong direction, or that needs to be repositioned into a frame, cut off and repositioned into an empty frame and rubber banded and given back to the bees. Eventually the bees threw off the rubber bands. Well, I was using these electric green rubber bands, so that's what it was. So I had to laugh at myself for being stumped at my own my own beekeeping. So every once in a while you'll just surprise yourself, and that was one of those, or paint. Sometimes I've seen new beekeepers paint the edges of their supers. You're not supposed to, just the outside, and the bees are sort of scraping it off. They don't like it being there. They want to put propolis or something, and sometimes you get little paint flakes too, so that can happen too. And then nothing, or very, very tiny little debris, right? Is it a dead colony? Is it requeening and there's a break in the breed cycle and nothing is happening? Or did you forget, like sometimes I do, I forgot, I just cleaned it the day before, getting older, you start getting forgetful. Or is it just this tiny, 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 tiny little cluster, and you have a colony that's just on its way out, it's losing its critical mass. So, that can happen too. There's very just slight debris, just a few bees left. So that could be the issue, but that definitely, it's time to go in the hive when you see that. And then, when I teach this class, I have all these pictures with arrows, and I ask people, what is this, if they remember what it is, but it takes another hour or so to do that. So I'm going to stop here, and then people can ask questions, and we can have a discussion or whatnot. Okay.
Well, great job, Christine. Hey, what's the best method for you to take a few questions before we leave for the night? Do you want to have them just add them to the chat and you read from the chat?
I'd rather if you read them to me, or if they raise their hand and they can ask personally. If you want to do the raised hand thing, and you can take them one at a time, or something like that.
Well, there was some on the chat. We'll just go through real quick. Have you ever had ants carry away fallen varroa mites? That was a question from Eric.
Yes. I haven't figured out how to do videos on Zoom, on the PowerPoints. I have this one ant. She has it on top of her head, hanging on, and she's running around. Yes, they do take varroa mites. Yes, I've seen it. Yeah, it's a dead bug to them. It's a dead, it's something that they can eat or store or whatever they do with the dead stuff they bring home.
There was a comment about when you were talking about the replacement boards and people were using political signs and stuff. Eric commented that he buys his boards in bulk through Uline.
Oh,
and
okay.
if he wants to comment on that, I don't know.
Does he have to cut them to size then, or do they come the right size?
I'll let him answer that.
No, I cut them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're perfect size for 10 frame, but obviously they work for 8 frame and 5 also.
Okay. And they're the thicker one, the thicker boards? Or
they're about a 1/4 inch.
Oh, okay, nice. I like those. Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Bruce Swenson had a question about when you were talking about the earwigs.
Mhm.
And he wrote, can you use beer to attract earwigs? It works great in the garden, he says.
I've never heard. I heard beer for snails, not for earwig. I think a rolled up wet newspaper works really well because they're looking for moisture, right? So I know that rolled up wet newspaper works to attract them. Does he have a lot of problem with earwigs or?
That's a question that he'll have to answer.
Is he there?
So Bruce, if you're there, if you'd want to add to that question. If not, we'll move forward. There's a question, how often should you clean your monitoring boards?
I clean it fairly often. Definitely after I do a hive inspection, I look, when I do a hive inspection, I look at the entrance, I see what's coming in, I look at the behavior of the bees at entrance, and then I pull out my monitoring board and I look what's on take my notes, what I see, look at what I saw last time, see if there's any difference, and then I clean it. There are people who have made more these drawer likes that are much deeper, and they just leave everything in there because they want to mimic what's going on in a tree, and in a tree nobody's cleaning the debris out. So it depends how you want to do it. But I clean it because I want to see the new debris, and I am looking at the mites that are dropping. I am following my hives inside the hive and outside the hive, how they manage their mites.
So Mary Benzinger has a question that deals with this. Do you recommend cleaning off your bottom boards at a certain distance from your hives?
Not necessarily. I do, if I see wax moth, I make sure either pinch them so that they're dead so they don't continue pupating in the pile of debris I made. Or I throw them to the chickens, but no, because there's nothing really, the mice won't be able to crawl back. They're not good travelers. Sometimes I'll just dig a little bit of the dirt, put the debris in and then cover it. If I'm worried that some things, I don't want anybody else to track on it or a bee to land on it, I might bury it or put it in my compost. Sometimes I've done that, put it in the compost.
Dick LaForge has a question, and there's a number of questions within the question. Dick, would you be willing to just go ahead and ask that live?
Yeah, sure. Because we had a little small hive beetle episode here where some were found, and we were looking at keeping an eye out, and I did see one of what I identified as a sap beetle with the narrow-bodied ones with the clubbed antenna. And so, the question was, are they actually a significant bee pest? Do they cause trouble? If so, in what sorts of areas? And is it something that we need to worry about?
Right. For my area, it's still considered a minor pest. Napa County, which is a county right over, they have a little bit more of it for some reason. They're hotter, drier. I don't know what it is, but they're more in the trajectory of commercial beekeepers. I don't know. Okay. But I have found that the bees can chase them off.
Okay, I'm talking about.
I've seen them make propolis jails in between the frames from one super and the next, where it's like a rectangle with a little opening, and they chase them in. And then sometimes when you crack it open, you disrupt it. You disrupt the jail. They start running off. I also use a wooden feeder box, not to feed my bees, but to put wicking material in. And I've seen bees chase some of the beetles in there. And so that's the first thing I do. I open up, I look to see if there's any beetles in it. I take my hive tools and I do whack a beetle. But I have not seen it to the point where when you have a real problem is when you start getting slime outs, right? where, remember that picture where it was all sort of shiny and oozy and things like that, where there's so many larvae in there that it's just fermenting the honey. I've only seen it in colonies that have like that bee tree that collapsed, or something happened to the comb where the bees couldn't patrol. So as far as I know, I don't know if there's more experienced beekeepers in your group, but I don't consider it a major pest here in Sonoma County. But I'm watching because, you know, weather patterns are changing and we don't know where we're going with all this different weather coming. And is it going to be a more, you know, hospital or, you know, a hospitable place here for them or not? I don't know, you know, so I'm watching. I haven't seen them be destructive to beehives so far.
Okay, it sounds like
Except in the drawn comb, you know, in the stored comb. That was not, you know, that was not fun.
Christine, it sounds like you're talking about the small hive beetle.
Oh, the sap beetle is very similar.
Okay. So
Similar. They don't know as much about the sap beetle, but it's the same thing. The beetles come in the hive, they lay eggs. The eggs hatch and then they start tunneling through the comb.
Okay.
And
We haven't seen that in the magazines or whatever, like we've seen tons of stuff about small hive beetles, but we haven't seen that about sap beetles. Does that mean they're not nearly so significant?
yeah, I mean, we saw a big surge of it suddenly, and then now we very rarely see them. So I'm not sure why. Maybe they're just not doing well here, or who knows, you know, maybe something ailed them. Maybe they have a disease, you know, and they're not thriving. Yeah, there's not, I mean, it's not spoken about a lot. I know hive beetles, like if you go to Hawaii or if you're in Florida or even maybe even Texas and Southern California, they have much more of an issue with the hive beetles, where they have thousands of them sometimes in hives.
Yeah. We have, well,
What was the
question
issue?
with the
What was the issue you saw?
Oh, I just saw one. I saw a beetle on the bottom board just sort of crawling around, and it had clubbed antenna, but I said, this is narrow. It does not shape like a small hive beetle. And I looked it up and it says, well, it's a sap beetle and it's really closely related to the small hive beetle. But it's a sap beetle is a category of beetles.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as what species it was, who knows? But
They
I just saw one
identified it
individual.
somewhere in the literature that you know, they identified which species it was and where it came from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is a
But I
particular
wouldn't worry until it's really starting to be destructive. It's very possible that your area is like our area, that they're going to be there, they're going to try, but it's not hospitable for them to live there.
So is it your opinion that, see, there's two ways you could look at the hive beetles. When we found some here, the county people took the opinion that they may take over and spread and we have to get rid of them. But it's either if they get here, they will spread and proliferate, or if they could do that, they would have already done it and the conditions aren't right. Do you have an opinion on your opinion? Sounds like maybe you think.
Yeah, they fly. And then look at what we've done with Varroa. How long have we been throwing chemicals and trying to get rid of Varroa? You know, it's you know, Varroa, at least they have to hitchhike on bees, but hive beetles, they fly and they don't need bees to survive. They can on the interim live on fallen fruit, right? So how are you going to get rid, you know, that would be my question, you know. It's like, how would you get rid of them? So there are beetle traps that you can put in with some oil and they fall in and they drown in it. There's people who use the unscented shop, those blue shop towels, you know, and they set them on there, and for some reason their little paws get stuck in it, you know. They use that as a method to get rid of them. But, you know, they fly. And if you have commercial beekeepers going up and down the state, going from pollination contract to pollination contract, they're gonna come along with that, and then they fly from one hive to another. They can find a hive miles away. They can smell it. So I would be very curious to see how they would go about trying to eradicate the hive beetle.
Well,
Oh.
so far, we've only had the one incidence that we know of.
Mhm.
And those people that had gotten their nukes from Bakersfield. So we're discouraging people from buying nukes out of
Yeah.
the county, especially Southern California.
The best thing you can do is to try to become as self-sufficient as possible, right? Because when bees travel and we're introducing bees from everywhere, we are bringing in things, unfortunately, right?
I agree with you, and I do believe that we have the ability, if we work together, to become self-sufficient, where beekeepers can sell their nukes in the spring when their bees prosper through the winter.
Yeah.
And we also can raise queens here because we still have gentle, non-scutellata.
Mhm.
We don't have those genetics here. And perhaps we have to think about having very strict regulations for anybody bringing bees into the county if we're going to be queen rearing and thinking about, protecting our, place from
Yes, I
hive beetle
Mhm.
and
I agree.
other things.
We have here in Sonoma and Napa County huge, partly because of hive density, we have a lot of commercial beekeepers parking their hives in huge lots of 75 to 100. My town of Petaluma is girdled by them, is just surrounded by them. And so there's a lot of contention right now between backyard and commercial beekeepers here. And I'm not sure how it's going to get resolved, because they want to be close to town to take advantage of the watered garden, because there's nothing out there otherwise, starting now. And they're bringing in all sorts of stuff. They're bringing in genetics that we don't want. They're just managing, and they're selecting bees that are very different than what maybe we want to try to do here when we try to do natural selection, trying to get to try to develop bees that are resilient on their own again, that are not completely dependent on man, right? So yeah, it's difficult. And if you want to do I would get on it now if you want to do regulations, about importing bees in. You will help your bees tremendously, I believe.
Can I interject? I want to mention that we shouldn't have recorded all this. We should have stopped the recording after the presentation. That's just my opinion.
Yep.
Okay.
You want to stop
And,
now, or you may be able to cut that part off. I don't know.
Okay.
Oh, can I ask,